Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing you guys my top 10 solo board games, in particular, the Euro Edition. Now, 1 year ago, I recorded my top 10 solo board games, and up to date, that has been by far my most viewed and most successful top 10 video of all time. For those who haven't watched the video, check in the description down below for a link. Now, this year, I thought I would revise the list, but in particular, zero in on Euro-style board games that happen to play well solo. While some of the games in that video from a year ago might have classified as Euro games, most of them did not, because there is something about Euro games that, typically speaking, does not resonate with me as a solo experience. I typically enjoy to play my Euro games with at least one human opponent, if not multiple human opponents. And one of the reasons why is because many Euro-style games, their solo variants are really a beat-your-own-high score type of solo solitaire experience. And I'm not a big fan of that type of solo game at all. I like solo games where you're either going up against some automa player, some artificial intelligence that simulates the presence of an actual opponent, or when there's a objective or multiple objectives that you need to meet in order to capitalize and trigger the victory condition. Other than that, I really do not like these beat your own high scores, compare your own high score type of solo games. There might be a few exceptions to that rule in this list. So without any further ado, let's go straight into my number 10. My number 10 solo board game from a Euro perspective is The Pursuit of Happiness by David Cherkop and Adrian Abella. And this here, The Pursuit of Happiness, published by Artipia Games, is a game of life for board gamers. This is a modern implementation of the game of life idea where you're just living your life, having a career, starting a family. However, this game branches out much more deeper because life is more than just having a few kids and deciding whether or not you want to be a doctor or a lawyer. There's also other things you partake of, different projects like running for president or starting a comic book club, or you want to have a wine collection, or you want to go jet skiing, different activities you want to partake in. Once you get a job, perhaps you want to climb up the ranks and get a promotion, or maybe even have a career change. All these things are possible. Do you want to date one person, or do you want to, test the waters and have the riskiness of being involved in more than one romantic relationship at the same time? All these cool things that you can recreate and kind of role play from a life perspective. Now, this is a worker placement game. And the really cool thing about this game is that the rounds kind of correspond with the decades of a person's life. And if you do not take care of your health from a physical perspective, from a quality of life perspective, from a short-term and long-term happiness perspective, then you're going to accrue lots of stress throughout the game. If you take on too much responsibilities and not enough leisure, then you're going to die younger than you would expect to. And therefore, you will not be able to even play all of the rounds that the game can possibly go up to. Now, the cool thing about the solo variant here is that it's not just, hey, score as many points as possible. At the beginning of each game, whether you're playing solo or multiplayer, you draw a couple of these objective cards. And in a multiplayer game, the objective cards are a way of scoring additional victory points, a reward for the person who accomplishes it first or accomplishes it best. That will get them more points, but not necessarily guarantee the win. In the solo game, there is no automa, there is no artificial intelligence. Nobody's going to interfere with your actions. However, you're going to have 2 or 3 different objectives each game, depending on what was drawn. And if you do not complete all of the objectives, you do not win the game. No matter how high your score is, no matter how successful you were at other facets of the game, if you did not accomplish those objectives, you are done. And that's cool because the objectives kind of force you to pay attention to certain aspects of life that perhaps you wouldn't have done so otherwise. Again, in the multiplayer experience, you can choose to neglect one or multiple of these objectives as long as you do well in the other parts of the game. But when you're playing solo, you're going to have to focus on those aspects of life, whether or not they're in harmony with your character that you chose or the child trait that you were drafted at the beginning of the game, or whether or not that's the type of lifestyle you want to pursue for that given game. If you want to accomplish the victory, that's something you're going to have to do. So this is my number 10 Euro solo board game, The Pursuit of Happiness. Now we move on to my number 9. And my number 9 solo Euro game is at the Gates of Loyang, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And Uwe Rosenberg is known for his big, grandiose worker placement style games, usually with an agricultural theme. Those games, in my opinion, do not play very well solo. Games like Ora Labora, La Havre, Agricola, Caverna. I've played all of these games solo, just kind of like to fiddle with the pieces and get a little bit into the other things that I like about them. But the aspect of solo gameplay does not appeal to me because, again, it's just trying to beat your own high score type of game. At the Gates of Loyang is a little bit different. There is an element of beat your own high score. You have a victory track that runs all the way up to 20, and the higher you go on that track, the better you did for that game, and you compare it to previous experiences. However, in this game, what's interesting is that in one of the phases of the game, there's this card drafting phase. They kind of have an automa player. So although there's not a full all-out automa player, at least for one of the phases of the game, the rules create this structure, this formula that you follow in order to simulate the idea that when you draft these cards, they're not all going to be available to you. Instead, the automa player, who's not going to have a score, drafts them and keeps them in their own player area. And you could possibly interact with those drafted cards in future turns, but at the moment what it does is it keeps those cards from your possession, so they might end up drafting cards that you would have liked to have. So that adds an element of challenge to the game. You do not know what to expect, because that's kind of one of the things that bothers me about these beat your own high score games. Euro games by nature don't have as much randomness or randomization as a Ameritrash game has, and while randomness is usually looked at as a negative quality, I find that for solo experiences, randomness is absolutely necessary because it keeps a game feeling fresh and feeling different from play to play. If you always know what to expect, then eventually you just fall into the pit trap of just doing the same things over and over again, implementing the same strategies. Maybe you have to coerce yourself to try something different just for the sake of shaking things up. But why would you if your previously executed formula worked out, right? Why would you try something different if that's the way to win? I don't know. So I like when games, although they are a beat your own high score, have that element of randomness. And that's exactly what this automa player does in this game. You're going to have these cards that are not necessarily going to be available to you. And then you're just trying to meet these contracts. You have these different regular customers and casual customers that are requiring specific type of harvest crops from you. And you're trying to, first of all, gain those seeds for those crops, plant them on your fields, reap and harvest those fields, and eventually sell them to your customers. But you have to keep these guys happy and content, in particular your regular customers who come with high demand and high return frequency. And if you're able to do this, you will not be penalized, and you will efficiently score points in the form of coins. And these coins are what you use as a currency to advance up that victory track. Really cool, really neat game. It plays very well multiplayer, in particular as a two-player game, but at the same time, you get the feel for it as a solo game as well, thanks to the randomness of that automa player. My number 9 solo Euro game of all time at the Gates of Loyang. And now we move on to my number 8. And again, we have Uwe Rosenberg with Merkator. And Merkator here is a pickup and delivery, again, contract fulfillment game. And the cool thing about this game is that you have different levels of contracts ranging all the way from level 2 to level 10. And then ultimately you have your final card or your final contract that you're trying to fulfill. And in this game, it's kind of like a ticking time bomb when you play solo. You basically flip over the highest valued contracts throughout the course of the game, and eventually you run out of time to complete all 10 levels of your contracts. And if you haven't done so by the time that time threshold has been triggered, then you did not successfully win the game. So there is no automa player that's interacting with you, that's interfering with your actions or being an obstacle to your choices. But at the same time, there's not a beat your own high score. You're trying to methodically work your way through all of these different contracts as efficiently as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to do so before before time runs out for you. And this is a really cool, abstracted, very looking game. The board consists of an abstracted map of Renaissance Europe, and you're moving this Mercator piece along all the different regions. And whenever you go to a particular country, whether it be France or Italy or Spain, you not only stimulate the economy for that current location, but all of its neighbors also have their general economy stimulated. And each location has a particular resource, a particular good that it is known for. And you can choose to gather up those goods and then in a future turn, deliver them to another location that has a current contract available in the lineup in order to retrieve the benefits, which come in the form of victory points. The game is very tight because you're limited as to how many contracts you can have at a time. You can only have 5 contracts at a given time. You can repeat a contract over and over again if you prefer, but ideally what you want to do is you want to work your way up to the higher, more valuable contracts. But again, all with the challenge of staying within the confinement of only 5 current contracts to work with and navigate through at the same time. There's bonus cards and building cards that you're selling contracts for money for in order to purchase those cards, which will score you points in additional ways. Again, it seems a little bit like a beat your own high score game, but it's not. It's really more of that objective-based type game where one by one you're trying to accomplish each of these contracts, and ultimately you're trying to accomplish that final most powerful contract of all. My number 8 solo Euro game of all time, Merkator. And now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 is Port Royal by Alexander Pfister. And this here is a pirate theme, nautical theme, press your luck type game where players are drafting cards, flipping them over from the top of the deck one by one, trying not to bust because you're trying to get these different merchant ships that will get you money. But at the same time, there's 5 different types of merchant ships corresponding with 5 different nations or 5 different banners. If you ever flip over a second card of the same banner type, of the same color, then you have busted. You are done with your turn. And every progress you've made during your turn is done. You discard all those cards and play proceeds to the next player. Or in this case, when you're playing solo, you run out of an opportunity to accomplish your goal. Now, the cool thing about this game here is the solo way to play this game is not in the base game. You actually have to purchase for yourself the first expansion. The first expansion adds contracts that introduces cooperative or solo play to the core system of Port Royal. And now all of a sudden you have an objective. You have to accomplish all of these different contracts in order to win the game. So it makes for a way for you to play the Port Royal game, have that same fun and excitement of trying to press your luck, at the same time be strategic about it and mitigate that luck by acquiring different characters that will allow you to mitigate that luck and perhaps repel some of those bad ships that will cause you to bust. Really cool. I like the contract fulfillment. Again, some of these games, it seems like a little bit of a overlapping theme for the first couple games, that it's an objective-based or contract-based style of a solo game, but it works for me. My number 7 solo Euro game of all time, Port Royal. My number 6 solo Euro game of all time is the Castles of Burgundy, the card game. And although the big box Castles of Burgundy does have some official and unofficial solo variants, this is my choice for playing Castles of Burgundy solo. This game here, as well as all the other games on this list, they all fall into the category of solo games with an automa or artificial intelligence opponent. First of all, the first 4 games on this list were all just objective based. These are all about actual opponents that can defeat you. Now, the cool thing about this game, they give a name to the AI player. I can't think about it at the top of my off the top of my head, but the AI player is randomly drafting cards to their player area at the beginning of each round. And those cards quite often are going to score them victory points. Then the human player is going to take their turn. And it's very similar to Castles of Burgundy, where you're trying to just complete certain sets and be the first to complete certain sets in order to score more points. The game rewards you if you beat your opponent to the punch in each of these different categories. And after the human player takes their turn, the round is officially over. And if the human player has points, victory points, equal to or higher than the automa player, then the game continues. If at the end of each round, the Automa player has more points than the human player, then that's it. The game is over. You don't even continue. Now, the game plays throughout the course of 7 rounds, and after the 7 rounds are done, if the human player has survived as long, then if the human player has more points than the AI player, then the human player has won the game. It's a cool little way of getting the Castles of Burgundy fix in a quicker time, and at the same time in that solo experience. At the same time, it is a table hog. These cards do take up a big table footprint, but it's a fun game. I'm a big fan of Castles of Burgundy, and when I want to get my solo fix, this is the game I pull out. My number 6 solo Euro game of all time, the Castles of Burgundy, the card game. And now we move on to the top 5, folks, the cream of the crop. My 5 absolute favorite board games, solo Euro board games to play. My number 5 is Wisdom of Solomon, and this here by Philip Dubarry is a Bible-themed worker placement city building game where players are trying to use their worker placement actions to accrue different resources, and those resources are going to be used to contribute towards the building of the Temple of Solomon. And this is basically the communal end game trigger for this game, is for the players to collaborate kind of, even though it's a cooperative game, in order to complete the Temple of Solomon, and that triggers the end of the game. Meanwhile, players are also using those resources that they will use to build these different buildings that they will add to their own player area. And these buildings either grant you permanent abilities or either special worker placement locations that are unique to you as a player. No other player can tap into your own personal collection of worker placement spots. Now, the cool thing about this game is that they have a full-blown artificial intelligence referred to as Jeroboam. And I really like the system for executing this player's actions. They have a bunch of these different action tokens that each correspond with all of the different possible worker placement spots. And they place them in a bag, and at the beginning of the turn, you're going to draw tiles randomly to determine where the Solomon player is going to go. And they're going to place their worker there, and it's not only going to block your character, but there's actually designated rules for what the Jeroboam player will do at each given location based on the Jeroboam's player's specific situation. I find that to be really, really cool. Now, at the same time, I do have to house rule this a little bit and give the Jeroboam player a little bit of a head start as far as victory points in order to make it challenging. Perhaps if I didn't have to make that house rule or account for that house rule, I probably would have ranked this even higher, because I really do like the process of flipping or drawing those tiles blindly to determine what the Jeroboam player could do. And quite often I am frustrated by what he ends up doing, and he ends up throwing a monkey wrench in my best laid plans, and I have to adapt and react and try to make other decisions on the fly thanks to that solo Automa opponent. I really think it's cool. My number 5 solo Euro game of all time, Wisdom of Solomon. And now we move on to my number 4. And my number 4 solo Euro game of all time is 7 Wonders Duel. And here I have my Pantheon expansion. And in particular, to play 7 Wonders Duel solo, you're going to need the solo expansion that came out about a year ago as a print and play on BoardGameGeek.com. And basically, it adds 5 possible Automa opponents. And that is really cool, really neat. Lots of these games in this list, as a matter of fact, most of them, if you have an Automa opponent, there is just one particular Automa opponent. But in the 7 Wonders Duel solo expansion, they add 5 different possible opponents, all corresponding with different historical figures. You got Hammurabi, you got a couple other characters I can't think off the top of my head. I think you might have Cleopatra. And you are trying to compete against these. And each of these different characters, these historical figures, have different preferences as far as their strategies are concerned. And they each come with a randomized deck that determines which actions they will take. So based on this, the human player has some concept, some knowledge of the preferences, the tendencies of the Automa player, and they can map out and decide, make their decisions according to those set up strategies and preferences of the Automa player. So I like that predictability of it all. But at the same time, you still have to account for the fact that you cannot just do whatever you want, because there's certain cards that are not going to stay in the tableau available for you to draft forever, because that Automa player is gunning for those cards. And quite soon enough, according to the luck of the draw from the deck, they're going to get that card and they're going to take it away from you. So I find that to be really cool. I think Seven Wonders Duel is a really neat two-player implementation of Seven Wonders. And whenever you want to scratch that itch, that Seven Wonders Duel itch, but you don't have a human player to get, I think that the Automa or the solo expansion is a cool, brilliant alternative. My number 4 solo Euro game of all time, Seven Wonders Duel. And now we move on to my number 3. And my number 3 was, I believe, on my top 10 list from last year, my generic top 10 solo board games list. And it also makes it to this Euro list here. And that is Race for the Galaxy. And Race for the Galaxy is one of my favorite games of all time. I love playing this multiplayer. As a matter of fact, I don't know if I've ever played it 3 players, but I played it 2 players a lot of times with lots of different human opponents. And this game is basically a civilization-themed game where players are trying to build and grow their intergalactic empire, consisting of their tableau of 12 cards, up to 12 different cards. And these cards consist of planets and different developments or technologies that all contribute to your victory point total, and at the same time grant you different abilities and additional ways of scoring points. And the cool thing about this game is that it kind of has that variable phase order thing from games like Puerto Rico and San Juan, where players are going to choose one of the actions that they want to take. In this game, it's all they're in 5 different phases, 5 different actions in 5 different phases. Players are going to simultaneously, though, choose which phase they want to trigger. They're going to flip up their action cards, show which phase they want to trigger, and then all players around the table are going to share in each other's selections. Now, if you've chosen a particular phase, then the game rewards you with an additional action. However, if you just piggyback on somebody else's phase, you'll still be able to at least capitalize the main action from that phase. Now, the cool thing about the solo game, and just like in Seven Wonders Duel and Port Royal from earlier, if you want to play this game solo, you're going to have to buy its first expansion, the Gathering Storm expansion. And this expansion, first of all, it adds an interesting racing element, true to the name of the game, Race for the Galaxy, for the multiplayer game, but it also adds a really cool and functional multi-opponent Automa option, because just like Seven Wonders Duel, I believe there's 5 different possible Automa players. Maybe I'm wrong. It might be more than 5. It might be 7 or 8. I don't know. Don't quote me right now. But it's at least 5 Automa opponents, and they each have different aspects of gameplay that they're focusing on, different strengths and different weaknesses, which again the human player can use to kind of strategize and map out their decisions going forward, because they kind of know the actions that the Automa player are going to gravitate towards. At the same time, the actions are actually determined by a roll of the die. There's 2 dice that you use to determine the 2 actions that the Automa player will take on each round. And that dice adds a level of randomness, just like I mentioned earlier. So there's already variety in this game from the perspective of having multiple different Automa opponents to choose from. And on top of all that, you've got this dice rolling that keeps you at the edge of your seat, on your toes, not knowing what to expect, and at the same time, really hoping and praying sometimes that those dice are rolled to your favor. Really cool. Again, if you are a big fan of Race for the Galaxy and you've heard bad things about the expansions, I cannot necessarily vouch for all of them. I can't even necessarily vouch for the Gathering Storm expansion as a whole, but definitely just for that solo variant, it is worth its weight in gold. My number 3 solo Euro game of all time, Race for the Galaxy. And now we move on to my number 2, and my number 2 is Viticulture, the strategic game of winemaking designed by Jamie Stegmaier and Alan Stone. And this here, very popular game, is a worker placement game where players are running their vineyards, they are planting vineyards, they are harvesting grapes, and they are converting those grapes into wine, and ultimately trying to sell wine orders that will result in money, which is a very valuable resource throughout the game, but it'll also result in victory points. Now, while this game is better to play as a multiplayer experience, the solo variant is very functional, and the gameplay is so enjoyable that it's hard for me to not rank it this high. Now, this game, it's almost like a beat your own high score game, because although there is an Automa player, the Automa player simply has a starting score. From the very beginning, you mark the Automa's victory point marker at the 20-point spot on the victory track. And your goal is in 7 rounds to have more points than the Automa player. So you have to have at least 21 points by the end of the 7th round. So there is a element of pressure and that time factor that you have to consider in the back of your head. But they don't really gain points otherwise. There might be the occasional situation where points might be taken away from them, but for the most part, they don't move around the victory track. And the only thing they really do is you flip over, at the beginning of each season, you flip over one of the cards from the Automa deck, and the Automa deck just tells you where to put their worker placement pieces on the board, just for the purposes of blocking those actions from the human player. They do not actually carry out any of those actions. Those are just an obstacle. They're just an interference with the human player and their plans. And again, that feels very basic at its core. The human player just basically does whatever they want to do other than those blocked actions. So you just kind of try to work around the nuisance of the presence of the Automa player. Now, typically speaking, I would feel that this would not have enough replayability, because after a few amount of plays, you kind of know or anticipate some of the Automa cards that can come out and have an idea perhaps as to which actions might be blocked. And even so, you can still find so many different ways to work around those actions in order to accomplish those 20 points. What makes this game work as a solo experience is that there is enough variety and randomness in this game created from the multiple decks of cards, between your vineyard cards, which you're not always going to be able to plant, between your wine order cards, which you're not always going to be able to fulfill, and between the different summer and winter visitor cards that are not necessarily always going to benefit you. Between all of those different decks of cards, there is enough randomness, unpredictability to make the game exciting and enjoyable from play to play, which is absolutely something that I need for my solo experiences. You combine that with the excellent, streamlined, elegant worker placement that's going on in this game, the wonderful thematic sense and tie-ins between the different cards, the different characters, and the actual gameplay. You combine that all, and this is just an excellent solo experience. It's also only 7 rounds, so it goes by pretty quickly, and at the same time, you feel the tightness and you feel the challenge of trying to outdo that Automa opponent. My number 2 solo Euro game of all time, Viticulture. And now we move on to my number 1, the absolute best solo Euro game, at least as far as I'm concerned, and that is Wingspan. And this game here, designed by Elizabeth Hargrave and published by Stonemaier Games. I guess that's 2 Stonemaier games in a row, so they're getting this thing right as far as their Automa variants that they introduce into their games. And this game here, Wingspan, is just a beautiful game. I find it to be such a intuitively designed game, and I'm sure a lot of that has to do, it's in collaboration with the designer and the publisher. You have your boards here, and your boards basically tell you what actions you can do, and they kind of walk you through the different phases of your turn. So I find that teaching this game is pretty simple from that perspective. At the same time, it's very highly strategic, because there's lots of card drafting that's taking place with these different bird cards that you want to place in your own board, which represents your nature reserve. And these birds are specific to particular regions or types of habitats on your board, so you can't just place them willy-nilly wherever you want. And also the birds have particular amounts of eggs that they can hatch throughout the year. They have particular foods that you need to acquire in order to even draft these cards, or not to draft them, but in order to place them down in your tableau, you're gonna have to pay the food tokens that correspond with them. Lots of really cool things. You only play this game in 4 rounds, and the neat thing about this game is that each round you have fewer actions, 1 fewer action than the previous one. So the game gets tighter as it progresses. That first round, you feel like you can do a lot. By the time you get to that 4th round, you have 3 fewer actions. and all the more pressure to accomplish as most as possible. The Automa version of this game, the solo version of this game, includes an Automa opponent, which just like Viticulture consists of a deck. But I find the deck of cards in the Automa here to be much more interesting, and the Automa opponent is a much more viable enemy, a much more viable challenge than Viticulture, because Viticulture, again, for the most part, that Automa player stays at the same spot on the victory track from the very beginning of the game. In Wingspan, the Automa player is actually taking different actions and making different choices that are going to score them victory points. And at the end of the game, you actually tally up their score, and quite often, they're going to beat you. And they even have a way of modifying the difficulty level based on including and excluding certain cards and changing a couple other aspects of the game. So if you want to like really make it challenging for yourself, you can. I think it's really, really cool. Very efficient way of playing a solo game that actually feels like you're playing an Automa player. And just true to the concept of this game, how intuitive it is, the Automa or solo variant feels very intuitive because you have all these additional aids that you use to line up the cards and tell you exactly what the Automa player is going to do in a given situation based on the current round. It's also going to tell you how much the Automa player scores for particular bonuses depending on their current situation. Really cool, really neat, beautiful game. As I mentioned, an awesome game just to have in your collection from a box perspective, from a table presence perspective. Great game to play with 2 players or with a group. And if you want to play this game solo, absolutely highly recommend the solo Automa variant in Wingspan. My #1 solo Euro game of all time, Wingspan. Thank you so much, guys. That's it for this list. Please comment down below and tell me what you guys think about my top 10 solo Euro games. What's your favorite Euro game to play solo? I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. Thank you so much for joining us here on Harry at Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.